Welcome to the Advanced Freelancing Podcast. Every week, you'll hear strategies for building your online service-based business your way. And now, here's your host, veteran freelancer, author, and TEDx speaker, Laura Briggs.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Advanced Freelancing Podcast. This episode is long overdue, not just because of the topic, but because of the guest. I am so excited about my guest today. She's probably sick of talking to me because we talk all the time on Voxer and in meetings, but I am bringing on my online business manager and the person who produces this podcast behind the scenes, Melissa Swire. Melissa, welcome to the show. Why don't you give everyone a quick introduction into who you are?
Well, thank you, Laura, for having me. I'm so excited to be here. My name's Melissa Swire, and I am so honored to be able to work with you, Laura. You are just so fabulous. You're one of my biggest heroes. My background is online business manager. I also do marketing work, and I'm thrilled to be behind the scenes producing your podcast. I also train executive assistants to work in the remote world and have a nonprofit called Patriots Cove, where we serve veterans, first responders, and their caregivers.
Yeah, you have a lot going on. And I think that's the embodiment of everything that people are trying to do in modern businesses, and especially in freelance businesses today. You have other passions, you have a life, you're working on this nonprofit, you're building your own alternative income streams. And I think that that is super important. And we were connected, honestly, it's almost been a couple of years ago now, which feels weird, by another mutual friend in this industry who, when she heard that I was hiring an executive assistant, said, "Oh my goodness, you need to meet Melissa. You need to talk to Melissa." And I understood instantly why as soon as we connected. So you came on board originally as my executive assistant, and it was clear pretty quickly that you have a lot of skills and can do a lot of things. And so what was your experience before coming on board as it relates to podcasting? Were you a listener? Had you worked on a podcast before?
I was a listener. I love podcasts, but I had never worked in podcast production and was just thrilled that you were willing to train me on how to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about podcasting. And then it's also this huge opportunity that's exploding in so many different ways. So for virtual assistants or business managers or project managers, there's this whole opportunity around production and the behind the scenes work. For social media managers, there's all of the creation of the materials that come out of this. For writers, there's podcast show notes. And like what I do for one of my clients is we repurpose their 45-minute episodes into blog posts and other things like that within their marketing. And so let's start by talking about just the kind of your perspective of what goes on behind the scenes of a podcast, because I know how much work it is. And we kind of joke that it's like the most expensive and time-consuming piece of free content that I create, but there's a lot that actually goes into it. So when you were sort of brought into this podcast, production piece of things, what is your perspective on all the things that happen before a listener actually hears an episode go live?
Sure. I absolutely love podcast management because it allows me to be so creative. I love graphic design and writing and sharing people's stories and storytelling and inspiring others. And all of those pieces fit into what we're doing into producing a podcast episode. So what happens is you give me the raw episode after you record with a guest. And really all of the moving pieces are going to depend on they're going to vary with different clients. So you may be, as a freelancer, working with editing the audio. Mm-hmm. That is something that you and I actually outsource.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But which I'm so thankful for. But the various pieces are writing the show notes, creating the graphics, and the social media content. then we publish the podcast to the website, and then the podcast hosting sites such as Libsyn or Buzzsprout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then if you're working on with a client on a retainer basis, such as what I do with you, you may be looking at podcast analytics. So each week reporting the number of downloads and reporting your KPIs. And you may be even going as far as suggesting podcast topics and various guests that could be coming on the show.
Yeah, I think that's really smart because by the time the episode that we're recording right now comes out, there's so many different sort of phases that this goes through, right? So like we had the original idea for the episode, then we have to book that episode in. And if we have a guest coming on the show, we need their biography, we need their headshot, we need the links they want in the show notes. We kind of need a rough map of what are we going to talk about while we're recording on the show. So before you and I hit record today, I sent you a list of questions and topics that we wanted to cover. So you felt like, cool, I know exactly where this direction is going. I'm not going to be hit with any surprise questions. And then after we're done, this will go over to a separate freelancer who's an audio expert, and they will fix all of the things like the background noise, or every time Melissa and I say or sneeze or something like that, that's kind of out of our control. And then that will be meshed in with the show introduction, the show closeout, any commercials that we're adding into the show. And then it gets ready to be uploaded on Libsyn. And so I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize is sometimes the host of a podcast really just wants to be the host. And this is where the opportunity is for freelancers to help them organize the podcast itself, make sure that it's a production, because it's very much that timeline, right? So when we release an episode, it's probably already been recorded for at least 2 or 3 weeks because it has to go through this whole process. And there's so much stuff that's happening behind the scenes. And we tend to record this show in batches. And so before doing this episode today, I recorded a solo one by myself. And that way it's easier for Melissa to go in and say, okay, great, our audio guy has finished 2 or 3 episodes. Let me upload all of those into our audio host at the same time. And we can start putting them through the various stages of when we release. So, you know, you're currently behind the scenes in not just my business, but I know that you work with another client, even though you don't work as directly on the podcast there. Both of the companies that you're working with use podcasting to grow their audience. So what is your perspective on the demand for podcast virtual assistants?
There's definitely a high demand for podcast virtual assistants, and there's so many different levels that you can assist. And it could be podcast pitching, it could be social media management. It's a really high demand, and it can be a very lucrative field to get into. And it's a great opportunity for freelancers. And I think that the need is just going to continue to grow.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's this sort of, because we all know, or at least have some sense that podcast episodes go through audio editing, I want to point out too that this is not something you need to learn. You do not need to go take a course, or you do not need to be a certified audio engineer. That is often the play. Like if podcast production tasks get split up among multiple freelancers, it is most frequently in that way, right? So even when I produced and hosted the Lawyerist podcast, I never had anything to do with the audio editing aside from telling the editor, hey, we really screwed up around the 17-minute mark and we had to restart our whole conversation, right? Like giving them notes of what to expect. And so you don't need to have any audio skills to be a podcast manager behind the scenes. I think it's really, I mean, I'm curious to hear your take. My perspective is that it's really about systems. It's about organization and scheduling. And then there's also that creativity piece too, right? So that is something that you and other members of the team come to me with. Hey, we've never done an episode on XYZ. This might make a really good either training webinar or a podcast episode, and we build that into our schedule. What other kinds of skills do you think someone who's interested in doing freelance work in podcasting is really important for this kind of work?
having project management skills is really important. A podcast manager really needs to be able to manage a lot of moving parts, really have a lot of attention to detail. That's important. And to be able to listen to the episode and pull out pieces that readers are going to pay attention to, listeners are going to pay attention to, and components that are going to resonate with them. Communication skills are really important to be able to work effectively with your client. You need to be able to have follow through because your client is expecting you to release these episodes on time each week. You need to have some tech skills because you are going to be loading the episodes onto possibly websites and to your podcast hosting sites. However, I totally agree with you. You do not need to have any formal certifications or trainings. These are all things that you can learn yourself. You can really do a Google search and learn everything. You can teach yourself everything that you need to know. And many times your clients are willing to teach you just like you taught me.
Yeah, that's really important because this is a good thing for freelancers because most people who run podcasts, they decide on one of two methods. They'll say, I'm going to release a show every single week, or I'm going to release a show in seasons. And so even if they do things in seasons, that might only be for 12 weeks or 16 weeks at a time where they're going to strategically release episodes. But if they're doing it weekly, that's recurring work for you. That is very much in the realm of building a system and making sure that you're doing things every single week. So for example, my episodes release on Monday. So what we strive to do is to have them done well in advance of that. And that way we have time to proof things. If there's a problem with the audio, right? Like we just discovered there was a problem with an audio I recorded recently. So because that episode isn't coming out for a little bit, we have some time to fix it. It really helps keep things on a schedule, but we know that one thing stays the same. Every Monday morning, an episode needs to come out. And that's going to be important no matter which kind of client you're working with, because building that regularity and consistency is important for getting listeners. And so another way you may be brought into podcasts, this is something I've done for a couple of my clients, is they are thinking about launching a podcast. And so you could be brought in as a marketing analyst to decide, is there space in the podcasting world for this kind of show? What should it look like? How long should it be? Should this be solo episodes versus with a guest? What should our runway be to launch? Because there's a whole other list of things that need to be done before launching a show. It has to be approved by iTunes. You need to submit cover art. You need to decide on the name of the show and make sure it doesn't infringe on someone else's trademark. And so you may be involved in that way, or you could be involved as a project manager with someone saying, hey, come in and build the system for me. What does the Trello board or the ClickUp project or the Asana project look like if we were to release a podcast, say, every Friday? And that would be your job to say, okay, what are all the steps that happen between when we have an idea for a show versus releasing it? And there's a lot of little things in between there. And that's really what a podcast manager does. So what are some of your biggest takeaways? What have you learned about podcast management and kind of the systems to support it as you've kind of learned this on the job?
I think my biggest takeaways are really just being open to listening and looking for opportunities to inspire and enriching other people's lives and telling the story.
Yeah.
When I listen to the Advanced Freelancing podcast, I work with you every day, and I am so blessed to have Laura at my fingertips. And I know that all of your listeners would just love to have that opportunity. And, every week as I produce these episodes, it amazes me the content that you're delivering to the listeners. And it fascinates me so much to just hear the valuable resources that are delivered.
Yeah.
It really does. And, as a podcast producer, I think that in so many different ways, it's an amazing process, and to just be able to use that creative muscle. And between graphic design and writing and telling that story, to be able to do that all in one outlet is just phenomenal.
Yeah, I love that you brought up this other aspect of working in podcast production, because there's two components of it, right? So one is all the things that you create in line with the show. The show itself, that actual audio file that gets released, is just one piece of the puzzle. We also create those graphic design elements. We might create 1 or 2 minute audio or video clips that we can release on LinkedIn to get someone interested in the episode. We're going to produce show notes so that we're getting that SEO benefit out of publishing the show. And sometimes you may even be involved in projects where you're repurposing that. You're saying, okay, let's take this 30-minute episode and turn it into a blog post. How do we tweak it to make it a good blog post? But the second component of what you brought up is this idea of learning new things on the job. And I think that is at the heart of someone who would really enjoy doing podcast production, is you like listening to podcasts. So I work with an agency where I help them with their podcast show notes, and the topics on the podcast that come up are extremely varied. Sometimes it is about banking and like the digital trends that are affecting banking. And then the next episode I'll edit, it'll be about a doctor talking about adrenal health. And the next one will be something about marketing tips. And so I get something out of listening to every one of those episodes because I just find it fascinating to listen to what these people are talking about. And I always pull away a takeaway that's for me, even as someone who's not maybe a regular listener of that show. And so I think it exposes you to a lot of things. It's kind of like built-in learning that you're getting paid to do as well, which I think it kind of gets into what I want to talk to you about next, which is what are some signs that an existing freelancer might like managing a podcast? Do you think there are certain personality traits or things that would make someone more likely to enjoy doing this kind of service?
Sure. So if you already enjoy communication, so if you already enjoy doing things in marketing, you may like being a podcast producer. If you already like organizing and seeing a project through, it may be something that you would enjoy. If you like writing or publishing content on a website, or like writing blog posts, it may be something that you would enjoy doing.
Yeah, I completely agree with those. There's such a system to it, which makes it easy to get clients and to plan to work with clients, right? Because most people a lot of people are surprised by how much work a podcast takes. And usually when they launch it, they'll do a lot of it themselves. But to keep it going, it really is something where you need a system and you need other people to help you. And most people are not going to quit though, right? They will a long time until they take a break from podcasting or until they quit. And so it's not going to be something where you do all this upfront work and then 3 weeks later they say, oh, this is too difficult, forget it. Lots of shows have over 100 episodes. Some of the long-standing podcasts I listen to are in the upper 300s, right? So it really just depends on what the person is trying to accomplish. But it's a very important part of their business, right? And you get to do the technical aspect of things behind the scenes, keeping things organized, right? Like making sure that a guest understands what's going to happen when they get into the recording room, making sure that we've made the most out of every episode. But it's also about how does this fit into the bigger marketing plan, right? How do we use the podcast to talk about things that are important in my business? And how do we use that to drive things like sales of courses or sales of coaching packages as well? And so I think there's a lot of different skills that would sort of, feed into this. So what advice would you have for other virtual assistants or online business managers or even writers or other people who are looking for a change? What advice would you have for them looking to jump into this? Is there anything they should learn or do first to be successful?
I think that if you want to get into podcast production, absolutely go for it. It's don't take a course, don't invest heavily into a course because, as we said, it's not needed. Just try it out. Find someone who is willing that you can shadow and create a portfolio with, and just go for it. My favorite tools are Canva for graphic design, either Asana or Trello to manage episodes, and for hosting, Libsyn. For audio, I love Next Day Podcast, or even Fiverr. And I would just say practice writing show notes. And you can just listen to other podcasts, find your favorite podcasts, and just create sample show notes and get into the habit of listening to at least one podcast every day.
That's such good advice. And I loved your suggestion to ask to shadow someone too. If you know someone that maybe doesn't have a role for a podcast producer, but they have a show, ask, hey, can I have a 20, 30-minute call with you to talk about how you scoped out the role for this person? What were you looking for? What does your podcast production schedule look like? And you may even want to do something where you may like exchange services, sort of barter, or maybe you like say, hey, can I shadow for this one episode from the time it's recorded to the time it's produced? Can I just see how this works so that I can say I have a little work experience? Because there's definitely a chicken and egg scenario here of, well, you've never actually worked on a podcast, right? And I can't get hired to work on a podcast because I don't have that experience. So look for other ways to build that experience. If you've ever worked on a podcast before, you've ever been a guest on a podcast, you've created one of your own, I think that also can help show that those behind the scenes skills that can get you over that hump of getting that very first client. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. You shared so much valuable information for our listeners. Is there any other tips or thoughts that you'd like to share as we wrap up?
Just trust the process and have faith in yourself, because anything with freelancing that is a block is usually just mindset. And as long as you maintain your confidence level, you can do whatever you choose to do and be successful at it.
I love it. I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Laura.